Welcome back to another study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're so glad you're continuing to join us. If this is the first video in this series that you're seeing, then I encourage you to go back and start at lesson 1, where we began in Matthew chapter 1, and we're going all the way through the Gospel of Matthew here at Pepper Road. We are generally looking at about a chapter per class. We're going to try to get through all of the Gospel in 3 months, and so that's about what our pace is. And so we're picking up in this lesson today in chapter 8. Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount, which is probably his most notable teaching during his lifetime. And now we're moving on to a series of miracles in the next couple of chapters, in chapters 8 and 9, intermixed with some other instruction, some other things Jesus has to say, but mostly we're focusing on the miraculous works of Jesus. And so we'll begin looking at that in chapter 8 as we begin in just a moment. Luke is away from us this weekend, and so Garrett is filling in for him. And then we have Isaac Munoz and Bryce Luffman also joining us for this chapter, and we're thankful for their participation today. Well, as we said, we opened up Matthew chapter 8, and we have a series of miracles, and particularly miracles that are interactive with people. A lot of healing, casting out demons, things of that sort. Now, it might feel like we've made a drastic shift. We've been for 3 chapters in the Sermon on the Mount, which is just instructive. You know, it's not activity. It's just Jesus instructing the people. And then we switch over, and now it's almost entirely these interactive miracles. But I think if we look back at the end of chapter 4, there is a connection between chapters 5 through 7 and then 8 and 9. And there's a passage back in chapter 4 that draws those together. Now, what is it that draws those together, Garrett?
Yeah, so Matthew 4 verse 23 says that Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. So Matthew 5 through 9 is kind of what that looks like. 5 through 7, you see that this gospel that Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, some of the things that he was teaching, and we see the people there impressed with the authority that he was speaking with. And then in 8 and 9, we see Jesus healing people. We see him healing the leper, and we see him here healing Peter's mother-in-law and casting out demons. So Matthew 5 through 9 is really just Matthew 4 verse 23 in action. It shows what Jesus was doing in that verse.
Yeah. And I really like to see connectedness. I want us to notice connectedness when we're reading through scriptures, because the way that chapters are broken up and the way that we a lot of times study things, we break it down into manageable portions, and that's fine. I'm not against chapter breaks, and I'm not against verse. I think those things are helpful. But remember, Matthew is writing a single unit. He's writing a single letter to describe who Jesus is. And so he didn't make those chapter breaks. He is writing a consistent message. He's got a consistent thought process as he's going through here. And so I think that is valuable to make those connections and understand, what is he getting at here? Well, he's getting at the Sermon on the Mount, the heart of Jesus' teaching. And then here, let me just give you a list of miracles that Jesus performed. I'd also just point out that this is also why we might find some of the chronology changed around in some of the Gospels. It's because Matthew, especially in this particular case, his point is not Jesus did this, then this, then this, but rather here are the examples of the things that I said Jesus did back in chapter 4, back earlier in the letter. And then now let me illustrate that. And so in Matthew's particular case, it doesn't matter what order these things are happening in. And so maybe if you see some parallel accounts and you go, well, this seems out of order, that's because it's just not the point of Matthew's gospel. Luke would generally keep a more chronological approach, because he would even use that language that says, and the next day, and then Jesus did this. And so his is more just kind of marching through the life of Christ. So we want to notice those kinds of differences as we're studying any particular gospel. Well, as Garrett mentioned, the first miracle that is recorded here in chapter 8 is that of the healing of a leper. Now, leprosy is not a disease that we think about much, that we come in contact with much, and yet it was a very common issue, common enough that the Old Testament law spends a great deal of time talking about what to do when you have leprosy or when someone in your community has leprosy. And so it not only is a common disease that they had to deal with, but then there are connotations and associations that are developed to go along with that disease. And so, Isaac, why don't you tell us about some of those connections between leprosy?
Yeah, good question. I think one thing that really helps us relate right now is with the coronavirus. We see how this one virus influences not just us physically, but in every realm of our lives. And leprosy, as you mentioned, kind of had some of those far-reaching effects as well. So Leviticus 13, Leviticus 14 spend a good deal of time talking about some of these ramifications. And so just to start with physically, as I was reading through that chapter and kind of looking at some of the things that just popped out physically are there are spots, there are scabs, there's sores, there's swelling. So this was just something that could be seen. This is something that was felt. This was just a terrible malady for the Jews. But beyond that, spiritually, it also affected them. So once someone began showing some of these symptoms, they were ought to go to a priest to be examined and re-examined. And a priest could deem them being unclean, being unfit for worship. So you've got those two things. You've got physically, you've got spiritually how this would affect them. But then socially may have been just as equal or greater with the impact that it would have had for someone that was carrying leprosy. So there was periods of quarantine. There was periods of social distancing that they were to retain from other people. One of the things that I found as I was researching and reading through this is they were supposed to, as they walked by people, they were supposed to take their hands and cover their mouths and yell out, unclean, unclean. Much the same way we might do today if someone tests positive for COVID, we might go on social media and say, hey, I have been tested positive for this and I'm going to maintain my distance. In a much more, I don't know if shaming is the right way, but in a much more socially taboo way, they were supposed to go out and say, unclean, unclean. And folks need to keep their distance. And so you wrap all of this together, you start forming this idea that lepers, they were outcasts, they were marginalized, they were often lived in their own colonies. And it makes this story that we're going to study here in Matthew even more alarming. The leper here is and I don't want to get too much into the next question, but the leper here is daring and he's desperate at the same time. And he approaches people that he should not be approaching.
Yes, and so in so many ways, it's stigma that is attached here, but not an unreasonable stigma. Let's be sure, and when God attaches that stigma, it's for good reason. It is to have leprosy is to have a painful and even deadly disease, and so God made provision. But then, as Isaac noted, he attaches that to a spiritual significance, that spiritual disease will keep you separated from God, and so God uses this physical disease to teach a spiritual lesson in the Old Testament. So, and I think in some ways, because of the way our thought processes go, sometimes people would have actually attached that spiritual significance to the person. I don't think God condemns the leper. Well, not just I don't think, he certainly does not condemn the leper spiritually, but it was to teach a lesson. And so that stigma, maybe even more so than God means for it to in the Old Testament, people then take that further and make that person even more of a pariah than they ought to have been. So, as Isaac said, he comes near, and there is some boldness, but there's also humility. because he does come near, but notice it says he bowed down before him. All right, and so he shows reverence to God. It is to the Lord. He's not demanding, but rather begging, as Isaac pointed out, in desperation. If you are willing, you can make me clean. Well, Jesus, his response, he says, I am willing, be cleansed. And we'll talk here in just a moment about what he says after that. But there's a real faith. The guy who is begging, he doesn't say, please, would you possibly do this? But rather, if you are willing, you know, that's not a demand. But he says, if you're willing, you can. In other words, I know you have the power. I'm not just asking if there's anything possible. I know what's possible. I just want to know if you're willing. And so there's again, boldness and humility really tied together there. I think about that in terms of us, like Hebrews chapter 4 and the latter portion there, verses 15 and 16, where it talks about our high priest who can sympathize, and we come boldly before the throne of grace. That doesn't mean we come with our chests poked out and demanding things of God, but rather I think it's this sort of bold humility, bold reverence that comes before the throne of God. Well, what is the nature of this miracle? How does Jesus bring about the healing specifically, Bryce?
Well, it says, as you already mentioned, when the leper asks, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Well, his response is, I am willing, be cleansed. And he reaches out with his hand and touches him, and immediately, the leprosy is cleansed. And this kind of goes back to a previous lesson in this class where you were talking about when Jesus healed, it was never questionable what the result was. It was never a halfway solution. There was no doubt. It was totally and completely eradicated. And as we see here, it was immediate. And leprosy, as Isaac pointed out, this is a very outwardly apparent and debilitating disease. It's not something that could be faked and all of a sudden be gone. I mean, it's very visual, and immediately when he touches him, it's gone.
Yes, and what you said right there at the end, particularly, is of interest. When he touches him, does Jesus have to touch someone to heal them?
No.
I think it's purposeful that Jesus reaches out and touches this man. And what does the old law say? Well, Isaac was just talking about it. Not only do you not touch someone who has leprosy, you don't go near someone who has leprosy. And if you do touch someone who has leprosy, well, then what's the result? You also are unclean. And so, again, there's that spiritual significance that you keep your distance, right? You keep your distance from disease, and, well, you keep your distance from spiritual illness, spiritual sickness. And so that we want to take care that we do not contract spiritual sickness, as it were. I think there's a lesson then to learn from Jesus reaching out and touching, in addition to the completeness and the wholeness of the miracle. The way that Jesus goes about performing this miracle, and I think several miracles, he is instructive even in that manner. Because what Jesus is showing is God does not become unclean. When God touches the unclean, it does not make him unclean. It makes the unclean thing clean. Now, we don't have that power. And so the lesson here is not that we can reach out and touch the unclean. No, we try to bring people to God where if they touch God, if they can come near into the presence of God and be touched by him, they can be made clean. And so I think that's would have been an impactful lesson, more so to the Jew who knew what it meant to touch a leper, that them seeing that would hit home with them, reading about it would hit home with them, maybe even more so, more impactful than it does for us. Now then Jesus says a peculiar thing here. He says, see that you tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So, first of all, let's talk about that going and showing himself to the priest. What is that about, Garrett?
Well, like Isaac mentioned, back in Leviticus 13 and 14, there's a lot of information about leprosy, about the nature of the disease, how they were supposed to handle it. And one of the things that you had to do to get over leprosy or to be considered clean again was to show yourself to the priest. The priest had to come and examine you and look and see that the skin disease was gone. And then you had to offer some sacrifices in order to be considered clean again. And so that's what Jesus is telling this man to do, is to go and be clean again. And, you know, you can imagine the joy that this man would have been felt to be a part of society again, to be able to go to the priest. And I think that, you know, based on some of the language of Leviticus 13, the priest would have known who this man was, because they're the ones that identified leprosy. And so imagine the reaction of the priest when you see this man who's been, you know, presumably been a leper for a long time is suddenly clean. Well, how did this happen? Well, Jesus had instructed him to tell no one, but to go to the priest. So just a really interesting thing that Jesus told him to do there.
Yeah, and so following the law, but also planting seeds. And I think that planting seeds says something about the first part of Jesus' instruction: see that you tell no one. Now, this is not the only time that we see this. We see this throughout Jesus' ministry. Mark, particularly in his gospel, highlights this instruction that Jesus often gives people not to tell. The hiding, the hidden mystery. Jesus maintains that mystery until the appropriate time. And so he regularly would tell people this, and it's as if Jesus is laying groundwork. He doesn't mean to reveal himself in immediate fashion, but rather in slow, gradual fashion, so that when he does reveal himself, I think the idea is that the people will have had enough time to see and hear and know, and there will be no excuses. So that when Jesus is fully revealed, there is no grounds to say, well, we just weren't sure about. No. The news had spread. Enough had been performed, enough signs and wonders, as Jesus would say to the Pharisees time and again, that they don't need anything else. And so I think that is the best explanation, the best thought as to why Jesus is constantly saying, not yet, don't tell people, keep it to yourself, is to have that slow, gradual. But it's not that he tells no one, go and tell the priest. And think about where he's planting those seeds to start with, among the very people who ought to have recognized Jesus most. Well, coming to the next story then, we find Jesus coming into Capernaum, which would have been where there would have been a garrison of Roman forces. And we come to a centurion who comes to him asking that the Lord might heal his paralyzed servant. And this is the first mention in Matthew's gospel of the centurions, of a centurion. And it's not the only mention. Not the only mention in the Gospels, and certainly that carries over into the book of Acts. We see centurions being mentioned there. But who are the centurions, Isaac, and how would they have interacted? What would the relationship have been with the Jews?
So a centurion was an officer in the Roman army. They could have anywhere between 60 to 100 men under their command. They acted much like military officers. They were peacekeepers, sometimes judicial enforcers. And I think a really good answer to who are centurions and what was their work about, the centurion himself gives us a pretty good definition in verse 9, or at least some of the things that go along with it. Matthew 8, verse 9. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. So these are men that are used to being respected, to be able to issue commands and to have those obeyed, and immediately. He talks of authority. He speaks of having soldiers under him. So these are men that are used to being in these positions of authority and of having a sense of respect to whenever they speak, what they speak gets done, and very immediately. So that's who the centurions were. They were Roman officials or Roman officials in the Roman army, in this case in Judea or in Galilee here. So the Jews' interaction with them probably was much the way that we think or would think if we had a governing official telling us what to do. They weren't super keen on them. They did not have the best of relations. Oftentimes Jews would think of centurions as being bullies, men that abused perhaps their power. So there wasn't the best of relationships there. But this centurion was different, even from the Jews' point of view. So in the parallel account in Luke, we're told that Jews come from the centurion who sent out messengers. And his ambassadors say, this man's deserving because he loves our nation. He's built us a synagogue. So there were some nuances, there were some differences there between each centurion, but generally speaking, Jews did not hold very much respect for centurions.
Yes, and as you look through all of that, you know, the centurions being enforcers of the Roman Empire, and the Jews looking at the Roman Empire as occupying oppressors. And so to varying degrees, they would hate the centurions. As you noted, this centurion is unique even among the Jews, but as a class of people, they hate them. They do not want them in Jerusalem or Capernaum or you know, in the area of Israel at all. And so this is a man who's ingratiated himself among the Jews, and yet he would be an exception to the rule as far as the Jews were concerned. I think, though, understanding who they are and understanding their relationship to the Jews helps us understand why Matthew would include this particular story. As we go back and we look at the various instances of Matthew bringing up Gentiles, this is falling into a pattern of Matthew bringing up Gentiles and their faithfulness. We talked about that all the way in chapter 1, that Matthew brings up 4 faithful Gentiles in the genealogy of Christ. And so I think centurions come to represent a particular brand of faithful Gentile, a very unexpected source of faithfulness. And again, as I said, the faithfulness of centurions almost becomes a theme in a portion of the New Testament, that among a centurion will be the first Gentile convert in Acts chapter 10. And so it's just really striking how there is a highlighting of that particular faithfulness. Well, this man's faith is displayed in some degree in him asking Jesus, but Jesus, it says that he marveled at this man's faith. And what is it about this man's faith that would cause that sort of reaction here, Bryce?
Well, in essence, the centurion is making a comparison of how he commands the soldiers and slaves, as Isaac was talking about, with great authority. And yet he points out 2 things. And one of those is he's not worthy of Jesus to come under his roof. So even though he expects this respect and sense of authority and to be seen as that kind of a person, he still humbles himself to say he's not worthy of Jesus coming under his roof. And then second one, he recognizes that Jesus has the same commanding control and authority, but he can say something to be done, and it happens not just with soldiers or people, but in the very creation itself. Jesus can speak it and it will be done. Jesus can say, be healed, and this disease will be gone. This ailment will be gone. And so just by giving that verbal command, the person can be healed. And so I believe those 2 things, as well as the fact that the next statement Jesus makes is that even the Israelites had no faith such as this one, that this is a Gentile. And to see this kind of faith from a Gentile compared to his own people who should have recognized him and known him, there's some marveling in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this total confidence, humble confidence in Jesus is just, is striking. And just as you pointed out, here's a man who has that humble reverence. I'm not worthy. Now here's a man with a lot more authority, a lot more weight to throw around. He has more freedom and command in this area than any Jew. And yet he says, not worthy. You compare that to the Pharisees and the scribes who, they would allow Jesus to come into their home. And they would look at him as a curiosity to be examined and tested. Here's a centurion who comes and just totally yields himself over as far as honor and reverence to Jesus. And then I would just mention this, that notion of the respect and the authority and having those concepts and being able to translate those concepts over to Jesus, I think is impactful. It's important. Sometimes people think that there are cultural notions that we can pick up. There are aspects of reality in our lives that we can pick up that do translate over into spiritual reality, spiritual truths. And so there's something to that notion of authority. Sometimes we talk about people don't understand authority, and so we have to sort of go through that. We have to talk about how to establish authority from the Bible. And that's all very true. But there are some people, because of their work, because of the homes that they've grown up in, they already kind of understand that. And I can tell you that there are a lot of people who grow up in a sort of regimented home. Maybe their dad was a military guy, or maybe, they just grew up in that sort of strict environment, that there's some elements that it's helpful. They understand that somebody has the right to say, this is what you ought to do, and that there's a need to obey the people who are in authority. And so different walks of life, we can find some commonality and say, that's like God. And so the centurion recognizes that based on what he's coming from, his experiences, he's able to come and say, I know what this looks like, and I'm familiar with this. Conversely, a lot of the cultural things we pick up, we've got to put down. Certainly, John has things to say in Luke's gospel when the soldiers come and say, what sort of soldiers ought we to be? He's got some things to say. You got to put this away. Maybe culturally that's what soldiers do, but you've got to put that away. And so that doesn't mean that the centurion comes and he's got everything he needs to know. It just means there are some elements where we can find some commonality sometimes between what we've learned and the truths that are revealed in God's word. I think, though, that the connections that the centurion is making here that lead him to submit to Christ, he is an example of cultural trends that helped him in connecting to Jesus. The Pharisees are examples of cultural trends that kept them from connecting to Jesus. And of course, they wouldn't be the only ones that illustrate that. Well, looking then to the next miracle, which is Peter's mother-in-law. Beginning in verse 14, when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. Now, let me just point out, fever for us just seems like such a mild sort of a thing. I mean, you get a fever, we take Tylenol, we take some aspirin, and a lot of times we don't even slow down our activity. We just go on about our business. Fever is a deadly issue throughout most of human history, and still is in many places. And of course, there are occasions where we understand the severity of high fevers that can't be brought down and so forth. But they didn't have nearly the ability to diagnose, to understand what was causing the fever, and even the very quick means of bringing fevers down. And so Very often when fever would strike, it just was a much more serious issue. But it tells us that Jesus healed this fever. And how does it tell us the extent of the miraculous healing, Garrett?
Yeah, so it says that he touched her hand, the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. And so she was sick in the bed, to the point of death almost. And Jesus touches her, and not only does her fever leave her and she feels better, she feels good enough to get up and wait on him, just showing the complete healing that Jesus had done. And so it would have left, again, like we mentioned earlier, it would have left no doubt that a miracle had occurred. It wasn't like Jesus waved his hand over her and a couple days later the fever went away. No, it was an instantaneous, she's better and she feels good enough to get up and wait on Jesus. So just another example of what Jesus was able to do and showing who he was.
Right. Yeah. Luke gives a little bit stronger language here when referring to the fever, and so that kind of helps us understand the severity of it. But the idea of it keeping you in bed, I was talking with someone not too long ago who had the flu, which may be something similar, that kind of knock you down sort of a virus, and she'd had the flu, and she'd gotten past it, or at least the fever had left, and it was nearly 2 weeks before she felt herself. And she was just stunned by this and went to the doctor, and the doctor, of course, told her that her age was higher than it used to be, and therefore recovery rates are longer than they used to be. But the idea of Peter's mother-in-law, so we're talking about somebody in a little bit older age bracket, recovery times are not immediate, to be sure. And so I want us to see that even something like this, a fever, which sounds to us like, okay, well, I mean, you get over a fever. Not like this, you don't. You don't just hop up and start doing chores and taking care of other people. You're nursed back to health. That's how we usually refer to that. But there is no nursing back to health. So he performs this miracle. And then it says in verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. As we look at the fulfillment of that, how do you see that being fulfilled here? And maybe in addition to the things that are being reported here in Matthew 8. Isaac?
Well, the context of this verse is, backs up to verse 16, when in that evening, it would seem the same evening when he had healed the mother-in-law of Peter, there are those that are demon-possessed and those that are sick are coming to him, and Jesus is healing them. So in that context, Matthew says that Jesus is fulfilling what Isaiah had written and previously prophesied. Yes, I do think this is just a partial fulfillment of that verse. It was funny, yesterday I was listening to this chapter on a podcast, or on my Bible app rather, and I must have been zoning in and out, because when I came to this verse 17, I recognized he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. I thought that sounds like Isaiah 53. I thought, no, I'm in Matthew 8, Jesus' crucifixion. That happens much later. This verse can't be applied to this section. I pulled it up and I go, oh no, that's right. That's exactly what it's talking about. Even though it's not a spiritual healing, Matthew here applies that verse that so often I associate with spiritual health and what Jesus did for us on the cross, and says that was in part on physical healing, what Jesus was doing here. So it's almost like I know sometimes gospel writers or biblical authors will use this already, but not yet, kind of literary device. So it's, maybe we think about it in terms of salvation. There's a sense in which we're saved now, today, when we're in a right relationship with Jesus. And yet there's a sense in which, a greater sense in which our salvation kind of comes further down the line. And I think Matthew's using similar type of a literary device here. There's a sense in which Jesus here is bearing the infirmities and the sickness, and he is taking them upon himself. But in a greater sense, those will happen down the road. The spiritual healing that Jesus brings is of a greater scope than the physical healing. Not that that's not great and so necessary and life-changing for these people, but what Jesus did for us on the cross is of even greater impact than what he's done there. And so I think that's how there's a partial fulfillment now waiting to be realized yet.
Yes, and absolutely. I think that it is pointing towards the spiritual, as illustrated by the physical, and so you're given it's like a promissory note in these physical forms of the spiritual reality. I would also say, just a reminder that connects what we've been talking about with the miracles Jesus performs. When he performs these miracles, and he does so completely, and he does so in the ways that he does, where he is making clean the unclean, where he is showing how powerful he is, even being able to heal from a distance, that he is communicating realities about those spiritual abilities for him to take away our infirmities. And so by reading of the physical miracles, we get elements of the spiritual healing and miracles that Jesus is able to perform. And so I think there's supposed to be a connection there. You know, just as Isaac said, when you read this, you think, wait a minute, that's Isaiah 53, and that's spiritual. Well, that's right. But as Jesus comes and he begins to fulfill, he fulfills in a physical way, so that when he makes the claims of the spiritual truth, the spiritual reality, well, there's no question. Okay, I'm certain that Jesus can do that. I'm certain, and we'll see that. We see that in the miracles that he performs, that he uses those to illustrate the spiritual power, the spiritual reality of who he is and what he's capable of. Well, picking up in verse 18 then. It says, now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. Then a scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds like exactly what you want to hear. Certainly what Jesus wants to hear. I will follow you wherever you go. And so in my mind, the response would be fantastic, right? That's just what I'm looking for. But he gives a peculiar response here and continuing on throughout the rest of this context. And so, Bryce, how does he respond to these proclamations of willingness to follow after him?
Picking up in verse 20, it says, Jesus said to him, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so what he says, in essence, is the birds and the animals, they have homes. But I am on a mission. I do not have the comforts of a home to lay my head in. I'm traveling. I'm going about teaching. And if you're going to follow me, this is the kind of work that we have ahead of us. This work is focused, little in ways of physical comforts, and you must be willing to forsake all these physical encumbrances to fully devote yourself into this work and to follow him. And then the next comment is that another disciple comes and says, let's see, in verse 21, another one of the disciples said to him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. And so again, Jesus is stating, you have me now. We've seen that before where Jesus says, don't chastise her for wanting to do what she can and not help in the kitchen. She has me now. And in the same way, saying, you have me now, let the spiritually dead bury their physically dead. You cannot waste time, because this calling we have right now is urgent. The time is now. The time can't be postponed. We need to do this, and this needs to be your focus. If you follow me, you got to have that focus.
Yes. Yeah, and so the two things that Jesus does here, well, both of them really tie together, is challenge their commitment. Can we follow you? I don't know. Can you? It's not going to be comfortable, and so it's almost like a discouragement. Are you sure? Are you sure you want to follow me? Well, I want to follow you, but I got to do this first. If that's the approach, then you're not ready. If you're ready to follow me, you're ready to walk away from everything. That's what we saw from the disciples when Jesus came and said, "Follow me." They set everything down and came. And so that's the kind of disciples Jesus is looking for. And I think we've got to come to grips with that reality. A lot of times when we're teaching people the gospel, sometimes we may fail to challenge people as we're going through the scriptures, and may even present a notion to them that there's great comfort and no challenges. I want to be honest about both. You can't overstate the comforts, and yet you can be very guilty of understating the challenges. And Jesus is very upfront. It's one of the realities, I think, all the way from the beginning of scriptures. God is always honest with us. He is always absolutely clear about what he's asking, about consequences, about everything that's on the table. And Satan is always lying to us. He's always hiding the realities, hiding the full weight of what faces us. He's saying God doesn't mean what he says, and people talk some ways as if God is hiding something. He's not really revealing everything. God is the one who truly is being absolutely honest, such that right here, God is not, Jesus, God in the flesh, does not sugarcoat this at all. Even though he could say, "Absolutely, I'll take whatever I can get." No, that wouldn't do anybody any good. So here's what I demand. Well, coming back then to the text, now it says that when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And there arose a great storm on the sea, so the boat was being covered with the waves, but Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men were amazed and said, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So, Garrett, this is a familiar episode. What are some lessons, some takeaways from what you see here in this text?
Yeah, so I think that what you see is just the total control that Jesus has over every situation, power over nature, and that's something that only God has. And so it really shows who he is, and that's what these men, his disciples, would have seen. That who is it that can control the winds and the waves? Well, that's God. There's some language in the Psalms about God being in control over nature, and so I think that's what this shows is that Jesus was God because he had the power over nature.
Yeah, and so maybe one of the most pointed miracles as far as establishing the deity of Christ here in these miracles that we're going through. All of them indicate being from God, but to control nature. That is God's prerogative. I would say one more element is just when Jesus wakes up, his rebuke tells us something, teaches us something. That when you are with Christ, you should behave differently than everybody else. It is perfectly rational to be afraid of a storm. In fact, Jesus' reaction seemed irrational. How could you be sleeping? But you're in the boat with God in the flesh. And so you ought to reflect that and say, I don't know what's fixing to happen, but God's with us. So whatever is okay. And so there's a rebuke there that when there are storms, of life, it ought to be that Christians rest the easiest, that we are the least disturbed by the storms of life because we're with Christ. We're with Christ. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I know who's in control of it all. Well, finally, we have one more miracle recorded in this chapter, and that is Jesus casting out some demons. Now, this is an interesting story of casting out of demons. First of all, we are given a plurality. It said that there were these two men who were demon possessed, and they met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were extremely violent, so that no one could pass by. And they cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" There's some elements here that are interesting. It indicates that they know that their day's coming, before the time. We've still got time left. And maybe this points to some elements of God's communication of his permission, allowing Satan more freedom to operate during the time that Christ is on the earth as an opportunity to show Christ's power. But at any rate, it tells us that now there was a herd of many swine feeding at the distance, and the demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you are going to cast us out, send us into that herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." Again, we get some more elements of this from some of the other accounts. They didn't want to be cast into the abyss. They viewed this as less traumatic somehow, and so they're asking for that permission. What do you make of that? Their request for that, Jesus's allowance of that, and then finally, why is it at the end of all of this that we read in verse 34 that when the people saw this, they implored Jesus to leave their region? So what do you make of all of that, Isaac?
First thing I want to acknowledge about this episode is you said, I think, interesting. It's a very strange account, this interaction with Jesus and these demon-possessed men. I think there's several possibilities as to why Jesus allowed the demons to possess the swine. One possibility, I think, is there's a power differential that Matthew sets up. So you've got these demon-possessed men in verse 28, who they're coming out of the tombs. He says they are exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. Some of the other accounts tell us that they had tried to been bound with chains and just could not be bound. There's you get the picture of these just monstrosities. They're just incredibly strong. And then you have Jesus come up, and it's almost like the bully. These demon-possessed men bow down. These demons bow down to Jesus, and they say, "Hey, we will do whatever to go." And Jesus says, "Okay," and he dismisses them into this herd of swine. So one thing I think this does is it shows us the tremendous power of Jesus. These demons recognize him, calling him the Son of God, and want to escape prior to the ultimate time when they cannot escape. That's one possibility. I think a second thing here is to remember that these demons were possessing men. They were inhabiting the bodies of people, victims. And throughout this entire chapter, Matthew has painted the compassion of Jesus when he reaches out and he touches a leper, when he's willing to go to the house of a Gentile, when he heals an elderly woman. There's compassion, there's love of humanity that Jesus displays. And here, Mark and Luke particularly tell us that once the people from the town come back and they're wanting to dismiss Jesus rather aggressively, the other Gospels tell us that the men sat there in their right mind, clothed. There's a sense of these men have been, in a sense, they are being restored. And it's important to remember that Jesus is the one that does that. And just one more thing that I'll notice, or that I'll mention that I noticed just right now is the interesting use of the word perishing. So in the account that Garrett just talked to us about, the disciples are afraid because they will perish in the water. And here, these demons perish in the water. And it's interesting to see how Jesus can either save us from perishing in the water or destroy us from perishing in the water. And just interesting that Matthew puts those two together. As far as that last question, why did the people want Jesus to leave? Again, it's hard to tell for certain. They certainly lost about, Mark tells us, around 2,000 hogs. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of livestock to lose. But Mark and Luke also mention fear a couple of times. Possibly fear of Jesus, possibly fear of losing more property, more finances. Don't know exactly what it was, but something in this in this account, when the herdsmen came back and told them of what happened, caused the emotion of fear to come up for them, and they asked Jesus to get out of town. They didn't want any more of what he had to offer. And it's unfortunate to see a compassionate Jesus taking care of men, while these people from the city don't care about what he's done to actually help them out in their region.
Yeah, and let me just add on a couple of things. There's some great observation, I especially like the connection of the parish word there. I would say in one instance, especially as we bring in Luke's account here, I wonder if these demons thought that they were avoiding perishing, and Jesus allowed them to go into the swine, knowing what that would produce, where they may not have known what that would produce. In other words, they ended up in the same. It's sort of like we don't want to end up perishing. We don't want to end up in the abyss. We want to go over there. Jesus says, "Okay, that's fine. However you want to get there is fine. That's still where you're going." And so I think that's one thing. I would just note the direction of the permission. You mentioned that their recognition of Jesus' power. They're not telling Jesus what to do. They're asking permission. Demons, if they commune with God, it is to ask permission. They do not make demands. I'm reminded of the demons in the book of Acts who don't know these men. They know Paul. They know Jesus. They don't know these men. And so there's a real difference in how they approach God and his people versus other people. Well, the other thing that I would note here about that is the idea that pigs and their role in Israel. And I do wonder if maybe you have some people participating in commerce that would not have been very pleasing to God. Pigs, of course, are an unclean animal. And here is a herd of swine in Jewish territory. It's not necessarily a certainty, but there's a distinct possibility that this was commerce, that because you think about that, just what you said of Jesus allowing them to go into that swine, they're destroying a lot of local economy. But maybe they needed that wake-up call, that you had no business engaging in this sort of commerce in the first place. And so again, maybe this miracle is more instructive than we even realize to the people there. As far as the people asking him to leave, it's just a whole variety of reasons. But one thing that I would note is that notion of the reaction to Jesus's miracles is often that fearful reaction. It's a shock. I think for us, we think only in terms of we would be impressed, right? We would just be like, wow. But I think we would be scared. Like if you truly saw someone with the kind of power that Jesus has, I don't know. I don't think I'd want to be near that. I don't think I would draw near to that. And especially if you're not sure where that's coming from, you're not sure of the implications of that. All you know is, I just want things to be normal. I don't want change. Just leave. And so I think maybe that sort of explains, or at least helps us try to get in their headspace of what's going on here. Why would they ask somebody doing favors for them to leave? Yes, the economic could be part of it, but I think also it's just, man, I don't know what to do with this. I just assume it not be here. Whatever this is going to cause, I don't want to be a part of it. And so that is going to be a not infrequent reaction throughout the Gospels. Isaac, do you have something there to add? Or? All right. Nope. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of chapter 8. And so we appreciate everyone tuning in. If you have questions or comments, we invite you to leave those in the YouTube comments, or you can contact us through our website. We'd love to talk more about these things, more about Jesus, about the Gospel of Matthew, and really about the Bible as a whole. I thank you three guys for joining in, and all the fellas that have been joining in and participate. I really appreciate that. It's a great help. We invite you to tune in to us next class, which will be hopefully Tuesday night, and be uploaded Tuesday night. And we look forward to studying Matthew chapter 9. Thank you again for joining us, and God bless.